The night has descended upon the vast, open plain in a way that feels almost ceremonial, as if the darkness itself is honoring the land it now covers. There is no rush in its coming. The shadows stretch slowly, folding themselves gently across fields and riverbanks, creeping softly over low mud-brick dwellings that have stood in some form or another for generations beyond counting. Overhead, the stars begin to reveal themselves, one by one. Shy at first, then more confident, casting a pale shimmer over the waters that slip silently through the heart of this ancient world. Here, between two great rivers, the Tigris, swift and restless, and the Euphrates, broad and deliberate, time has always moved differently. The rest of the earth may change with sudden storms, with violent upheavals, with forces that tear apart and rebuild in moments. But here the pace is measured, almost hesitant, like a heartbeat slowed by deep sleep. The waters themselves seem aware of their role. They do not simply pass through. They linger, they breathe, they watch. The Tigris whispers in quick, fluid syllables, its current gliding over smooth stones, curling around reed beds that sway in the evening breeze. The Euphrates hums in a deeper register, its voice rolling low and steady, like the ancient chants of priests calling the dawn in temples long gone. Together they sing a harmony that has carried across millennia, a sound as constant as breath, as enduring as the earth beneath. And in that sound, if you listen closely enough, there is something more than water moving to the sea. There is memory, a memory so old it feels like it belongs to the bones themselves. In the darkness, the air is warm, touched by the lingering heat of a day spent beneath an unblinking sun. It carries the faint perfume of ripening grain, barley heads heavy and swaying, their golden tips brushing each other in slow, deliberate gestures. The smell of wet earth rises too, rich and fertile, a gift left by the yearly floods that bring both life and destruction in equal measure. Somewhere far off, a small fire crackles, the smoke rising in thin, curling strands into the night, carrying with it the scent of bread baking on hot stones, of onions and lentils simmering in clay pots. These are the smells of life, here not the luxuries of kings or palaces, but the enduring sustenance of people who know the river's moods better than they know the shifting winds of politics or the sharp edges of war. And it is in these small, repeating acts, kneading dough, filling water jars, tying reed bundles for tomorrow's repairs, that civilization, in its truest sense, began to take shape. Not in the flash of conquests or the rise of mighty walls, but in the quiet agreements between people and the land that held them. They learned the river's language, the way the water told them when to plant and when to harvest, when to store grain and when to expect the floods. They shaped clay into jars, not merely for function, but for beauty, letting their fingers leave gentle marks in the soft earth before the fire hardened it into permanence. They began to scratch signs into clay tablets, not poetry yet, not laws, or decrees, but counts of grain, tallies of sheep, the earliest records of exchange and memory, the first threads in the great fabric of human history. Some nights, when the wind settles and the waters run especially smooth, it feels as though the entire plain is holding its breath. The stars hang low and heavy, their light spilling onto the river's surface until the boundary between earth and sky becomes uncertain. You might imagine that those who lived here first, those who built the earliest villages of reeds and clay, must have looked up at this same sky and felt the same question stirring. What does it mean to belong to a place? For it was here, more than anywhere else, that the answer began to form, not in words, but in the simple truth of returning each season to the same banks, of trusting the same soil to yield life year after year. In this way, the land and the people shaped each other. The rivers gave them water, fertile earth, and a way to travel between scattered settlements. In return, they gave the rivers their patience, their attention, their willingness to work with the rhythms of nature, rather than against them. Over time, these rhythms became stories, and the stories became traditions, and the traditions laid the foundation for what we now call civilization. But to them, in those first centuries, it was simply life, slow, constant, and full of the quiet dignity that comes from knowing your place in the great turning of the seasons. If you stand here now, listening to the distant lap of water against the shore, the faint rustle of reeds, the occasional soft call of a night bird, you will hear more than just the sounds of nature. You will hear the echo of footsteps along the banks, the splash of a clay jar lowered into the river, the low murmur of voices sharing stories under starlight. You will feel the pulse of a land that has been both cradle and keeper, a place where human hands first learned to build not just shelters, but homes, not just fields, but communities, not just survival, but memory. And as you let these sounds and sensations drift over you, as you feel the gentle pull of the rivers carrying you deeper into their slow, winding current, you may begin to sense the comfort that those early settlers must have felt, the comfort of knowing that, for all its unpredictability, the river would always return, the soil would always renew, and life would always find a way to begin again. In that comfort, in that quiet assurance, there is a kind of peace that asks nothing of you but to listen, to watch, to remain. So, let yourself remain here for a while. Let the warmth of the Mesopotamian night wrap around you. Let the silvered light of the stars rest gently on your closed eyelids. Let the hum of water and wind lull you into that soft place between waking and sleep. And if you find yourself moved by this journey, we are beginning this slow unfolding of the story of where we all came from. Invite you to walk it with me, step by step, riverbend by riverbend. Share your thoughts, your reflections, as we move forward. Like this quiet current, join the flow, leave a comment, share this story with those who might also wish to drift along its banks, and subscribe to this gentle voyage through time. For tonight, the rivers whisper, and we will listen together. Block 2, the first villages, before the high walls of cities, before the voices of kings echoed in temple courts, before the stories of gods and empires were pressed into wet clay. There was the quiet beginning, the first small gatherings of people who chose to remain where the waters lingered. These were not yet cities, nor even towns in the way we think of them now. They were clusters of homes, modest and close to the earth, pressed against the curve of the rivers as if for protection, leaning into the slow breathing of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Here, humanity began to test a different way of living, one rooted not in movement but in the act of staying, of placing faith in the rhythm of a single piece of land and the cycles it promised to keep repeating. The earliest shelters were made of what the rivers and marshes gave free lator reeds cut in bundles, woven tightly and bent into arches, covered with layers of mud that dried into thin crusts under the sun. When the wind moved across them, they creaked softly, like old boats shifting on their moorings. Later came walls made from sun-dried bricks dug from the riverbanks, mixed with straw pulled from the threshing floor, pressed into wooden molds, and left to harden under days of open heat. These bricks carried in their rough surfaces the faint scent of the fields, the memory of the water that once ran through them. Roofs were flat, layered with beams, mats of reeds, and more clay, forming spaces where grain could be dried in the sun, where figs could be split and left to sweeten in the heat, where families could climb on warm evenings to sleep beneath the stars. The air cooler and cleaner than inside the narrow rooms below. The village was never silent. Even in the earliest light of morning, before the sun broke the horizon, there were footsteps along the paths, women walking to the river with clay jars, the sound of water sloshing as they returned, the tap of a wooden pestle pounding grain, the low murmur of neighbors exchanging a greeting in voices still thick with sleep. Chickens scratched at the dust near the doorways, goats bleated softly from pens made of woven branches. Dogs wandered lazily between homes, pausing to sniff at cooking pots set out in preparation for the day's meals. From the flat roofs came the scent of bread baking on stones, the smoke curling upward in thin ribbons that disappeared into the pale sky. The fields stretched outward in every direction, a soft mosaic of cultivated plots, each one defined by the narrow irrigation channels that carried water from the rivers. These channels were fragile, veins essential, yet easily damaged by flood or drought. They demanded constant care. Men and women worked side by side along their edges, packing clay into places where the water seeped away, pulling reeds to reinforce the banks, opening or closing small gates of woven sticks to direct the flow. They worked without haste, but with a steady, unbroken attention, speaking little, letting the rhythm of the task carry them forward. The sun climbed slowly above them, the air warming by degrees, the scent of wet earth rising from the channels, mixing with the dry, grassy smell of the barley fields beyond. Barley was the heart of the harvest here, its tall stalks moving in long, slow ripples when the wind passed over them. Dates hung heavy in clusters from the palms, their sweetness a counterpoint to the grain's plainness. Lentils, onions, and herbs grew in smaller plots near the homes, tended more carefully, watered more often. Nothing was left to chance. Every plant had its place, every drop of water its purpose. The people here were not yet farmers, as we know them. They were still learning the ways of coaxing life from the soil, still marking in their minds when the floods came, when the first shoots broke the surface, when the heat grew strong enough to threaten the crops. And they remembered that was perhaps the greatest change. Memory was no longer only about the past. It was now a tool for the future. As the day wore on, the work shifted. Some repaired fishing nets in the shade of the date palms, the fibers rough and damp between their fingers. Others shaped new jars from clay, the spinning of the potter's hands slow and deliberate, smoothing the walls, shaping the lip, cutting it free to be left in the sun. Children carried bundles of reeds, their bare feet slapping softly against the packed earth paths, their laughter echoing faintly across the fields. Even the animals moved in a certain rhythm, her oxen plodding in wide circles to thresh the grain, donkeys swaying under loads of firewood gathered from the edges of the plain. When evening came, it arrived like a soft closing of the world. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched toward the river, the water reflecting streaks of copper and gold before fading to deep blue. The air cooled, carrying with it the faint sweetness of flowering reeds. In the center of the village, fires were lit, their glow spilling onto the ground in trembling circles. People gathered, sitting cross-legged, bowls of stew warm in their hands, the bread torn and shared without ceremony. There was talk, yes, but also long silences, the kind that are comfortable among those who have worked together all day. And always there were the stories. Elders spoke in low, unhurried voices, telling of floods so great they swept away whole fields, of years when the harvest was so plentiful the grain had to be stored in every empty jar, of how the rivers had once run wild and untamed until the people learned to guide them. These were not yet myths or epics. They were lessons, wrapped in memory, meant to be carried forward. Children listened with wide eyes, their heads leaning against the knees of parents or grandparents, the firelight dancing in their faces. Overhead, the sky deepened, stars appearing in slow succession until the whole dome was alight. The constellations turned, their paths as familiar to these villagers as the winding of the rivers themselves. Some watched them in silence, tracing the patterns with their eyes, feeling the vastness beyond the reach of the land they knew. Yet here, in the glow of the fires, in the warmth of the gathered community, the horizon could wait. If you close your eyes now, you might hear it, the steady lap of water against the shore, the crackle of the fire, the soft rustle of palm fronds in the evening breeze. You might feel the warmth of the clay jar in your hands, the rough weave of a reed mat beneath you, the nearness of others breathing the same cool night air. In this place, in this moment, there is no need for walls or towers. There is only the river, the fields, the fire, and the people who share them. It is enough. And it is here, in this quiet sufficiency, that the seeds of all that would come after were first planted. Block 3, the first innovations, the rivers, had always been generous. But generosity alone was not enough to sustain a growing people. The floods came each year, swelling the Tigris and Euphrates until they spilled into the fields, leaving behind a rich, dark silt that seemed to breathe life into every seed planted there. Yet the floods were not predictable in their measure. Some years they arrived too late, some too early. At times they rose too high, sweeping away the fragile channels and washing out young crops. At others they failed to come at all, leaving the soil dry and cracked beneath a pitiless sun. It was in this uncertain balance that the first great shift in human skill took root, the quiet revolution of guiding water where it was needed, when it was needed. It began simply, shallow trenches dug by hand, lined with reeds to keep the sides from collapsing. Small gates woven from sticks and bound with fiber, opened to let the water in, closed to hold it in the channels until the soil had drunk its fill. Over seasons, these channels deepened, their roots made more deliberate, their edges reinforced with layers of clay. What had once been an act of survival became an art, the art of irrigation. In the early light of morning, men and women would walk the length of the channels, their bare feet sinking into the damp earth, checking for breaches, smoothing the banks with flat stones, letting the water speak in its own soft, moving language. They learned to hear its needs, to sense by its speed and depth whether the flow was right, whether the fields ahead would drink or drown. With the shaping of water came the shaping of the earth itself. Mounds were raised to guide the flow, low ridges built to hold it back, shallow basins dug to let it pool for later use. This manipulation of the land was not the work of one person or one family, it was the work of all, a shared investment in the future. Children grew up with the knowledge of where each channel ran, of which curves were prone to collapse, of where the silt would settle thickest after a good season. In this way, knowledge became as vital a resource as the water itself, and with the water came abundance. Fields that had once yielded just enough to survive began to produce more than was needed for the next meal, the next season. Grain could be stored, not just for the months between harvests, but for years when the floods might fail. Storage jars, once small and few, became larger, their rounded shapes designed to keep the grain dry and safe from pests. These jars were lined up in shaded rooms, their openings sealed with clay and marked with small impressions, early signs of a system to track what belonged to whom. How much had been stored, how much had been taken. It was here that another quiet innovation emerged: record keeping. At first it was simple marks, scratched into wet clay, pressed with the edge of a reed or a small carved tool. One mark for a jar of grain, two for 2 jars. A different shape. For oil, another for dates, another still for livestock. These marks were not yet words, but they were something equally powerful, the beginning of memory outside the mind. A record that could be seen, touched, and understood even by those who had not been present when the transaction was made. In this way, the village began to carry its history not only in the stories told around the fire, but in the silent, enduring language of symbols. Alongside the growth of the fields came the refinement of tools. The first sickles were made of wood, their curved edges set with small, sharp flakes of flint. With each harvest, they were shaped and reshaped, their grips smoothed by the sweat of countless hands. Hoes with stone blades turned the soil more icily than bare hands could. Simple plows, pulled by oxen, began to scratch longer, straighter lines into the fields, making the planting faster, the harvest more abundant. Each new tool was an extension of the body, a way to turn the effort of one person into the work of many. The rhythm of life began to change. Work was still hard, still bound to the turning of the seasons, but now it was guided by more than just the rise and fall of the rivers. The people had learned to shape their environment, to bend the flow of nature, not to conquer it, but to meet it halfway, to stand as partners in the creation of abundance. And in that abundance came the first taste of something new: time. When the fields were well watered and the stores full, there was time to rest, to gather for reasons other than necessity, to think beyond the next flood, the next planting. Evenings in these times were filled with a different kind of energy. Fires burned brighter, meals were larger, the air rich with the scent of roasting fish, baking bread, and the sweet, dense fragrance of dates warmed by the flames. There was laughter, more frequent and more open, and the stories told by the elders began to stretch further back, reaching into the distant past for lessons, into imagined futures for dreams. Children played longer in the twilight, their games growing more elaborate, weaving elements of the adult world into their make-believe, digging miniature channels in the dust, shaping tiny jars from mud, pretending to count the imaginary grain they had harvested from the reeds. Overhead, the stars continued their endless turning, watched now with a different kind of attention. People began to notice patterns between the position of certain stars and the coming of floods, the timing of planting. The night sky, once only a backdrop to the campfire's glow, became a map, a calendar, a silent teacher. If you find yourself drifting into this moment, feeling the slow pulse of the village in its newfound abundance, you might hear the soft trickle of water in the channels, the muted thud of grain poured into a jar, the rhythmic scrape of a tool against the soil. You might smell the mix of earth and smoke, the sweetness of fruit, the faint tense of wet clay drying in the sun. And you might sense, deep in your bones, the quiet pride of a people who have begun to see the future not as something that simply arrives, but as something that can be shaped patiently, gently, like the guiding of a river into the fields. block for gathering the people. The rivers had taught them how to feed themselves, and the earth had answered their patient tending with grain, fruit, and the steady return of life each season. But as the villages grew, as the channels deepened and the fields spread outward, something else began to take shape, a sense that the people themselves needed more than food and shelter to remain whole. They needed places to meet, to speak, together, to decide, to remember. They needed spaces where the scattered threads of individual lives could be woven into something shared. It began, as so many things did, with the clearing of a space. In the center of the village, where the paths naturally converged, the ground was leveled, swept clean of debris, the hard-packed earth smoothed by countless bare feet. Here, in the open air, people began to gather not just in the evenings, for the warmth of the fire, but in the brightness of day, when work in the fields could be paused, when decisions had to be made. They came to discuss the repair of a collapsed channel, the division of stored grain, the sharing of tools, the care of animals. At first, these gatherings were simple circles, everyone standing or sitting as they could, the voices rising and falling until an agreement was reached. But slowly, over seasons and years, these spaces began to take on more form. A raised platform might be built from mud bricks, giving a place for an elder to stand where all could see and hear. Posts might be set into the ground to mark the edges of the gathering place, their tops carved with simple pattern spirals, waves, the shapes of reeds and fish. These were not yet monuments, but they were beginnings, the first physical expressions of the village's shared life. And then came another kind of gathering, not for decisions or disputes, but for something deeper, something older than the village itself. It happened at moments when the rhythm of the seasons shifted, when the floods receded, leaving behind the rich black earth, when the first green shoots broke through the soil, when the harvest was gathered in. On these days, the people came together not to talk but to give thanks, to acknowledge the forces that lay beyond their hands yet within their lives. They had no temples yet, no walls to enclose the sacred. The sky was their roof, the earth their floor, the river their altar. Offerings of grain, fruit, or fish were laid on mats woven from reeds, left where the water could touch them, as if returning a portion of life to the source from which it had come. Over time, these acts became more elaborate. Someone might carve a small figure from clay, a woman with wide hips and full breasts, her hands resting on her belly, a symbol of the fertility that sustained them. Another might shape an image of a fish, or a bird, or the crescent moon. These figures were simple, their forms rough, but they held a power that no tool or jar could match. They were the first attempt to make the unseen visible, to give shape to gratitude, to fear, to hope. As the years passed, these gatherings and rituals wove themselves into the life of the village as surely as the planting and harvesting did. Children grew up knowing the times of year when work would pause, when the people would come together to sing, to dance, to eat the best of what they had. They learned the songs passed down from their elders, the steps of the dancers, the meanings of the figures. They learned that there were moments when the river was not just water, but something more, something that gave life and could take it away, something to be honored and appeased. These moments of unity brought a change in the way people saw themselves. They were no longer just families living side by side, each tending its own field, each storing its own grain. They were part of something larger, a body made up of many hands, many voices, many hearts beating in the same rhythm. And as this sense of unity grew, so too did the need for structure. Elders began to take on roles that extended beyond their own families, speaking for the village in matters of trade, settling disputes, deciding when to call for the repair of a channel or the digging of a new one. In this way, the first outlines of leadership appeared, not the rule of a single person over many, but the guidance of those whose wisdom had been proven over years of living in harmony with the rivers and the land. On quiet nights, after the songs and dances had ended, after the fires in the gathering place had burned low, the village would sleep with a different kind of peace. The water still whispered in the channels, the wind still moved softly through the reeds, but there was also the steady hum of a people who knew they were not alone, not just in the present moment, but in the story they were shaping together. The clay figures rested in their places. The offering mats still lay at the water's edge. The marks of many feet still pressed into the earth of the gathering space. And all of it, every trace, spoke of something new and enduring, the slow birth of community, of shared memory, of the first fragile roots of what would one day grow into the cities and temples and kingdoms of Mesopotamia. If you let yourself drift into that space now, you might feel the warmth of the sun on the hard-packed earth beneath you, hear the low murmur of voices mingling with the sound of the river, smell the sweetness of ripe dates and the smoke of cooking fires. You might see the faces of those gathered lined with age, bright with youth, lit by a shared purpose that needs no words to explain. And in that vision, you would understand, this is where civilization begins, not with stone walls or armies, but with people coming together, looking into one another's eyes, and knowing they belong to the same story. Block 5: Paths of Exchange. In the beginning, the idea of trade was as natural as the changing of the seasons, as unremarkable as the shift from morning to night. It happened without planning, without formal agreement, without the language of bargains and contracts. One family had a surplus of grain, more than they could eat, before it began to lose its strength in storage. Another, a day's walk downriver, had more fish than they could keep fresh in the heat. A path between them already existed, faint, but visible in the flattened grass where bare feet had passed before. And so one day, grain moved in one direction, fish in the other. No one thought of it as invention. It was simply what made sense, as simple as the river carrying water from its source to the sea. The first of these exchanges were humble in scope. A jar of barley, carefully sealed with clay, swapped for a basket of smoked fish wrapped in palm leaves. A bundle of sturdy reeds traded for a skin of oil pressed from sesame seeds. A coil of rope made from twisted fibers, offered in return for a handful of dried figs, their sweetness concentrated by the sun. These goods passed hand to hand, carried in baskets, balanced on hips, or tied with strips of cloth and slung across shoulders. The exchange was slow, unhurried, with no fixed hour or place. If you needed something, you went to where it might be found. If you had something in excess, you carried it until you found someone in need. The paths between villages were narrow, sometimes only a single line of flattened earth through the tall grasses, sometimes nothing more than the memory of a way walked often enough to be found again. They curved gently with the land, avoiding the marshy hollows, tracing the higher ground where the soil was firm. At certain points they crossed shallow streams, where stepping stones sat half buried under water smooth as glass. At others they skirted the edge of date palm groves, where the shade broke the heat of the day and the ground was littered with fallen fruit. The river, of course, was the great silent partner in these early exchanges, where the paths met its banks. Boats waited simple. Dugouts made from single tree trunks, their surfaces smoothed by countless journeys. They lay half in the water, their bows resting on the mud, the smell of damp would rising from them. Traders would load them with goods, arranging baskets so they would not tip, covering them with woven mats to keep off the sun. A push from a pole would send the boat drifting away from the bank, the current taking it with a lazy pull, carrying it downriver toward another village, another bend, another meeting. Traveling by river was easier than walking, and so the waterways became the first true highways of this land. Downstream travel could be silent, effortless, just the sound of water curling away from the bow, the occasional creak of wood, the soft call of a water bird startled from its perch. Upstream was slower, requiring steady work with poles or paddles, sometimes even pulling the boat along from the shore with ropes. But even then, the river was a guide, a companion whose voice never stopped murmuring against the banks. As these journeys became more common, the variety of goods grew. Some villages had the finest clay for pottery, smooth and pliable, perfect for shaping jars that would last years without cracking. Others had more fertile fields for certain grains, producing barley with a taste and texture prized in every settlement. Still others lived closer to marshes rich with reeds for weaving mats and baskets, or near groves of palms heavy with dates, or in places where fish were plentiful in the warm, shallow waters. Slowly, each settlement came to know itself, not just by its people or its location, but by what it could offer. This knowledge gave rise to the beginnings of specialization. A potter might spend days shaping and firing vessels, not only for her own family, but for others many miles away. A fisherman might cure his catch with salt so it could last the long walk inland, carrying with it the smell of the river and the taste of distant waters. A weaver might braid rope strong enough to hold the weight of heavy cargo on a boat, her knots recognized by their distinctive twist. These goods began to carry identity with them, as if the hands that made them left an invisible mark in their work. In the quiet of these exchanges, stories began to travel as well. A man bringing a load of grain might return with news of another village's harvest, of a flood that had come earlier than expected, of the birth of a child or the passing of an elder. Stories passed along these paths, like the wind carrying the scent of rainlight, unseen but felt. A woman might send a gift along with a trader for her sister married into another village, a small clay amulet shaped like a fish for protection, or a woven pouch filled with herbs for health. In this way, the trade of goods became the trade of memory and care, a way of holding on to connections stretched across the plain. Somewhere along these well-worn paths, certain resting places became known shaded groves near a bend in the river, flat clearings where the ground was firm enough to set down heavy baskets. At first they were simply places to pause, to drink from a waterskin, to share a handful of dates before continuing on. But over time, they grew into informal markets. People knew they could come to these spots not just to rest, but to meet others bringing goods from elsewhere. Reed mats were spread on the ground, goods laid out in neat rows, hands gesturing, voices rising and falling in the slow dance of exchange. There was no coin yet, no fixed price, only the instinctive understanding of value, shaped by need and the effort it took to create or gather what was given. The river carried not only goods and news, but ideas. A new way of building a channel bank to prevent collapse. A method for weaving baskets tighter so they could hold finer grain. A song that kept the pace of paddling steady on a long journey upstream. These two were traded intangible, weightless, but as lasting as clay and as precious as grain. In this way, the plain between the rivers began to feel less like a scattering of isolated villages and more like a living web, each strand a path, each knot a meeting, each crossing an opportunity for something new to pass between hands and hearts. Even when the day's journeys were done, when the traders had returned to their own hearths and the boats were pulled high onto the bank, the influence of these exchanges lingered. A jar in one home might have been shaped by hands that had never set foot in the village where it now stood. A mat underfoot might have been woven from reeds cut in a marsh many days' travel away. A child might hum a tune learned from a traveler whose name no one remembered. The village itself became a collection of distant places, stitched together by the invisible threads of exchange. If you close your eyes now and walk one of those paths in your mind, you might feel the weight of a basket on your hip, the warm sun on your back, the whisper of barley stalks brushing against your legs. You might hear the muffled sound of footsteps on the packed earth, the call of a trader greeting you from a distance, the low, steady rush of the river when the path comes close to its banks. You might see the slow bend of the water, the shimmer of light on its surface, and feel that same quiet pull that has always drawn people toward one another, the need to give, to receive, to share in the abundance and the burdens alike. And as the path carries you onward, you understand that these exchanges, small and humble though they may seem, are the first true currents of civilization, flowing not just through the rivers, but through the hands and hearts of all who live between them. Block 6, the first gathering places in the earliest days of exchange. There was no fixed point where trade was conducted, no permanent stall or marked boundary for the meeting of people and goods. It was enough to find a shaded grove by the river, a clearing where the ground was firm, or a bend in the path where travelers naturally paused to rest. But as the seasons turned and the paths between villages became more worn, the gatherings grew more predictable. People began to know, not only that they would meet others along the way, but where and when they would find them. The places themselves began to take on a kind of presence, remembered in the same way as a landmark or a familiar face. At first, these spaces were marked by nothing more than the traces of past meetings, the flattened grass where mats had been laid, the darkened earth where cooking fires had burned. But slowly, as people returned to the same places again and again, they began to shape them with their hands. Stones might be arranged in a rough circle to mark the edges of the gathering. Posts might be set into the ground, their tops carved or painted, both to honor the spot and to make it easier to find from a distance. Reed mats could be rolled and stored there for future use, weighted down with stones so the wind would not carry them away. Over time, these gathering places took on more than one purpose. They were still markets, still spaces where grain and fish and oil changed hands, where news passed from village to village. But they also became places for real talk, not just the casual exchange of greetings. Here, elders could meet, to settle disputes, to decide whether to repair a channel now or wait until after the floods, to arrange for the care of a family whose stores had been ruined by bad weather. Decisions made in these spaces carried the weight of the whole community, for everyone present could hear them, and all could see them carried out. The river's edge was often chosen for such places, for it was here that people could arrive by boat as easily as on foot. The slow, wide bends became natural gathering points, the water deep enough to anchor boats without fear of them drifting away, the banks gentle enough to climb without strain. The sight of boats drawn up on the shore became a signal that something was happening that others had come from far-off villages, that there would be goods to see, stories to hear, perhaps even music and dancing if the meeting went long into the night. It was in these spaces that the first permanent communal structures began to rise. At first, they were simple shelters poles, driven into the ground, roofed with mats of reeds to keep off the sun. Then walls began to be added, not to enclose completely, but to break the wind and provide shade. Inside, the ground was leveled and packed firm, large enough for dozens of people to sit together in the coolness. These were not yet temples, but they had a sacredness of their own, born from the fact that they belonged to everyone and to no one at the same time. As the gatherings grew in importance, so did the spaces. A platform of mud brick might be built at one end, where someone could stand to address the crowd. A bench might run along the walls for the elders to sit. In some places, a large, flat stone was placed in the center, used for displaying goods during trade, but also for placing offerings during moments of ceremony. For even here, in spaces meant for exchange and decision-making, the spiritual was never far away. The same people who weighed out grain for trade also laid their hands on clay figurines of the river spirit, or poured a small libation of oil onto the ground before the start of a meeting, asking for favor in the discussions to come. Music and storytelling became common in these spaces. A trader arriving early might play a simple flute carved from river reed, its sound carrying across the water, announcing his presence before he was seen. In the evenings, after the goods were packed away and the decisions made, a circle might form around a storyteller whose voice could hold the attention of the entire gathering, weaving tales of floods and heroes, of the first planting, of the stars that watched over their work. These stories were not written, but the place itself seemed to remember them, its air filled with the echoes of voices long gone. Children grew up knowing these spaces as part of the pattern of life. They knew when the boats would come, when the markets would fill, when the air would hum with the sound of many voices speaking at once. They knew the smell of fresh fish laid out for trade, the texture of barley under their fingers as it was poured from one jar to another, the feel of the packed earth warm beneath their feet as they ran between the stalls. They learned to watch the elders as they spoke, to listen for the decisions that would shape the work of the coming weeks. In time, the act of meeting itself became as important as the trade or the decisions made there. The journey to the gathering place was an event, a chance to see familiar faces and meet new ones, to hear news from far-off villages, to strengthen the invisible threads that tied the people of the plain together. And as the years passed, these spaces became more than just convenience. They became symbols, anchors in the shared memory of the people. To stand there was to stand in the presence of countless meetings past, to feel the weight of all the voices and decisions and exchanges that had shaped the life of the community. If you close your eyes now, you might hear the low hum of voices, the soft slap of water against the hulls of boats, the rustle of goods being unpacked, the laughter of children running past, the call of a trader greeting an old friend. You might smell the mingled scents of grain, fish, oil, and the faint perfume of flowers brought from another village as a gift. You might feel the sun on your face as you look out over the river, knowing that this place, though made of simple materials and open to the wind, is one of the true centers of life here. And you would understand that the first great buildings of civilization were not palaces or fortresses, but open spaces where people came together, spaces built not to separate, but to join. Block 7, from meeting places to sacred ground. It is difficult to say when a space meant for gathering becomes a space meant for worship. Perhaps it happens slowly, almost invisibly, over the course of many seasons. At first, there is little difference between the place where grain is weighed and the place where thanks is given to the rivers. But slowly, the gestures of gratitude, an offering of fish placed by the water's edge, a handful of barley set aside before trade begins, start to gather their own weight, their own sense of separation from the everyday. People begin to step into the space differently, moving more quietly, as if the ground itself listens. The river has always been the silent center of life here, and it is no surprise that the earliest sacred acts take place where its voice is loudest. At the curve of a bank where the water slows and deepens, or at the point where a channel branches, away toward the fields, offerings are made here in the simplest forms. A clay bowl of oil poured onto the water, a garland of reeds floated downstream, the first fruits of the harvest laid on the damp earth for the current to take. These acts are not yet formal, but they are already woven into the life of the village as naturally as planting or fishing. Over time, these offerings begin to collect in the same places again and again. A flat stone by the riverbank becomes worn smooth by the hands that place gifts upon it. A certain tree at the water's edge becomes known for the ribbons of dyed cloth tied to its branches, fluttering softly in the breeze. These places begin to hold a sense of presence, not a person, but of something more diffuse, something that seems to rise from the land and water themselves. People start to speak of the river not just as a source, but as a being, one who must be honored if the floods are to come at the right time, if the fish are to be plentiful, if the barley is to grow tall and strong. And so, as the gatherings in the market spaces continue, another kind of gathering begins to form alongside them. A place is set apart, not far from the meeting grounds, yet distinct. It might be marked at first by nothing more than a low wall of mud brick, enclosing a space open to the sky. Inside, the earth is swept clean, and at its center stands a single table of stone or clay where offerings are placed. Around it, people stand in a circle, voices rising together in songs that speak to the river, to the earth, to the sky. These songs are slow, rhythmic, as much a part of the ceremony as the offerings themselves. The act of building for the sacred is different from building for the practical. A shelter for goods is made quickly, with whatever is at hand. A shelter for the spirit is made with deliberation. The walls are straight and strong, the bricks chosen carefully. Reed mats are woven with patterns that echo the flow of water or the shape of fish, then hung to soften the light within. Clay figures of animals, of women heavy with child, of men with broad shoulders, are placed at the edges of the space, their features simple yet powerful. As these sacred spaces grow, so too does the role of those who tend them. Certain people, often elders, sometimes those said to dream vividly, or to hear the river's voice in their sleep, take on the care of the place. They sweep its floor, repair its walls, prepare its offerings. They learn the words and melodies of the songs, teach them to the young, ensure that the rituals are done in the right order and at the right time. These keepers of the sacred space are not yet priests as we think of them, but they hold a kind of authority, born not from command but from trust. The community begins to see these ceremonies as essential. Before the planting of the barley, an offering is made. When the floods begin to rise, another. At the first harvest, the largest and best heads of grain are brought, laid carefully on the altar, their golden stalks shining in the morning light. These acts are not done in private, but in the presence of all, reinforcing the understanding that the life of each person is bound to the life of the whole, and that the life of the whole is bound to the forces beyond human hands. Eventually, these sacred spaces grow larger, their walls higher, their decorations more intricate. Patterns are pressed into the bricks before they dry, showing waves, spirals, the marks of fish and birds. Some have small pools within their walls, filled from the river, their surfaces reflecting the sky so perfectly that to look into them is to look into another world. The altar stones grow broader, smoother, their surfaces darkened by the countless offerings placed upon them. Children come to these spaces with the same mixture of awe and familiarity that they bring to the river itself. They know the sound of the songs, the smell of burning oil, the sight of the clay figures standing silent in their corners. They learn, from the time they can walk, that some places are for play and others for reverence, and that the boundary between them is not drawn with lines in the earth, but with the way one moves and speaks within them. As night falls on a day of ceremony, the sacred space takes on another life. The flicker of firelight on the clay walls makes the patterns seem to move, the figures to shift and watch. The songs rise and fall in the darkness, blending with the sound of the river just beyond. The air is thick with the scent of oil and incense made from crushed herbs. In that moment, it is easy to believe that the river hears, that the earth listens, that the sky leans closer to receive what is offered. If you close your eyes now and step into one of these spaces in your mind, you might feel the coolness of the packed earth beneath your feet, the warmth of the fire on your skin, the low vibration of many voices singing as one. You might see the flicker of light on the water in the pool, smell the mingled scents of clay, smoke, and flowers. And you might understand that this is more than a place, it is a bridge, a way of standing between the human world and the world of the unseen, a way of speaking to the forces that have shaped life since before the first village was built. In these spaces, the first temples of Mesopotamia are already waiting. Their walls not yet high, but their foundations lay deep in the shared heart of the people. Block 8, the temple's shadow, the sacred spaces, had begun as open places by the river, marked only by the gifts left there and the footsteps of those who came to give them. Then came the low walls, the altars of stone, the carved posts and patterned bricks. With each season, the spaces grew more defined, more intentional, their outlines rising in the memory of the people as much as in the soil. And as the temples, though no one yet called them, that became more central to the life of the villagers, something else began to shift. The gatherings here were no longer only for the honoring of the river and the earth. They began to draw decisions, judgments, and the slow weaving of authority toward themselves, like the river drawing all its channels back into one broad current. It happened quietly, almost naturally. The keepers of the sacred spaces, those who knew the songs and the order of the offerings, were already people of respect. When disputes arose between families, it was to these keepers that both sides turned, trusting their wisdom, their ability to listen, their closeness to the forces that decided the floods and the harvests. At first, the keepers mediated in the same open spaces where the ceremonies were held, the air still heavy with the scent of burning oil. But soon it became clear that decisions made here carried more weight, as if the walls themselves added their own voice to the judgment. Trade, too, began to pass under the temple's watchful presence. The meeting spaces by the river had been the first markets, but now stalls and mats began to appear closer to the sacred walls. People believed that conducting trade under the eyes of the river spirit would ensure fairness, that agreements made within earshot of the temple songs would hold true. The keepers did not set out to control this, but their role naturally expanded. They began to record agreements in simple marks on clay tablets: who had given what, who had received, and when. At first, these records were meant only to settle any future disputes, but soon they became a way of tracking the flow of goods through the village, a quiet map of its lifeblood. The temples themselves grew in size and in presence. Walls rose higher, casting long shadows across the open ground in the morning and evening. Inside, the decoration became richer not in gold or jewels, for such things were rare, but in the care with which every surface was shaped. Bricks were pressed with patterned seals before they dried, their designs telling stories of the river's journey, the growth of the barley, the turning of the stars. The altar stones were smoothed to a sheen by countless hands, their edges worn soft by the weight of offerings placed and replaced. Around the temple, life began to organize itself differently. Families who tended the sacred space lived close by, their homes clustered in its shadow. Artisans who made the offerings, potters, weavers, carvers also, began to settle nearby, so their work could be easily delivered. Traders set up their mats and baskets in the open areas just beyond the temple's walls, knowing that the flow of people to and from ceremonies would bring customers. Slowly, almost without anyone deciding it, the temple became the center not just of worship, but of daily life. With this centrality came influence. The keepers of the temple began to speak not only of the river and the harvest, but of the needs of the people when it was time to dig a new channel, when to send a group upriver to gather reeds, when to store more grain than usual because the floods had been low. Their words were not orders, but suggestions so weighted with trust that they were followed as if they were law. In this way, the beginnings of governance were born not from the will of a ruler, but from the shared belief that those who served the gods also served the people. Ceremonies became more frequent, more elaborate. Special days were set aside for the blessing of tools before planting, for the consecration of boats before a trading journey, for the purification of storage rooms before the harvest was stored. These rituals drew people from smaller villages nearby who came to stand within the temple's walls, to place their own offerings, to carry home the blessing of the sacred songs. And with each gathering, the temple's reach grew not through force, but through the deep and quiet pull of shared faith. At night, when the market stalls were empty and the boats tied up along the bank, the temple remained. Its walls caught the moonlight, its shadows lying long and still across the ground. The air was heavy with the dais incense and the altar. Stone still held the warmth of the sun. Those who lived nearby sometimes said that they could hear the temple breathe at night, the creak of its beams, the soft settling of its bricks, the faint whisper of wind moving through its open spaces. In these sounds, they imagined the presence of the river spirit, the earth mother, the sky father Watin, listening, guiding. If you close your eyes now and stand in that shadow, you might feel the coolness of the packed earth beneath your feet, the texture of a brick wall beneath your fingertips, warm from the day's heat. You might hear the distant lap of water against the riverbank, the rustle of mats being rolled up, the last fading notes of a song sung in the evening ceremony. And you might understand that here, in this quiet blending of the sacred and the practical, lies the true beginning of cities, not in stone towers or high walls, but in the moment when people gather around a place they believe holds the heart of their world, and choose to shape their lives in its shade. Block 9, the birth of cities. It began so quietly, so gradually, that those living through it would never have named it as a change at all. Life in the land between the rivers had always been a pattern of flowing water and fertile earth, of planting and harvesting, of the market spaces and the temple gatherings. Villages rose where the river curved, where the soil lay dark and rich after the floods, where channels could be dug to guide the water toward fields of barley and stands, of date palms. There had always been clusters of homes, meeting places, stretches of cultivated land broken by reed beds and groves. And yet, without planning, without the will of a single hand, something was gathering, drawing life inward like a slow, deep breath. It began around the temples. These sacred spaces, once simple enclosures of mud, brick, and red, had grown higher and stronger, their walls casting shadows that stretched across the open ground. They had become the anchor points for trade, for decisions, for celebrations and mourning alike. People who wished to live close to the center of that rhythm, close to the market's bustle, the temple's ceremonies, the voices that shaped the work of the seasons, built their homes in the shadow of the sacred walls. First came a few houses, then more, each added wherever space allowed, until the paths between them curved and narrowed like streams finding their course. These homes began simply, as all homes did, but permanence has its own gravity. The walls were no longer woven reeds smeared with mud, to be rebuilt after every flood or storm. They were bricks of clay and straw, dried in the sun until they rang hollow when struck. They stood in neat rows, their corners aligned to fit tightly together, their flat roofs wide enough to work upon by day and sleep upon by night. Families painted the door frames with patterns, waves for the river, spirals for the cycle of planting and harvest, lines for protection. Courtyards, small at first, opened in the spaces between houses, where families could cook, repair nets, dry grain, and sit together in the evening light. As the houses gathered, so too did the markets, where once traders had set down their baskets at the edge of the temple grounds. Now lines of stalls appeared, woven from reeds and shaded with cloth. Traders began to claim their spaces, returning to the same spot day after day until the market itself became a familiar map. You could walk through its narrow lanes and know where the fishmongers would be, where the potters laid out their jars, where the weavers hung their cloth in fluttering sheets of red and brown and pale blue. The air was thick with the smell of trade, fish fresh from the river, the grassy scent of drying reeds, the nutty aroma of oil, the sweet perfume of dates. Voices rose and fell in an endless chorus, greetings, offers, questions, laughter blending with the calls of traders who sang the quality of their goods as if the sound alone could bring buyers closer. Workshops began to grow from the soil of the city as naturally as the date palms along the river. A potter might build a kiln near the market so she could fire her jars and sell them without carrying them far. A weaver might keep his loom near the stalls so customers could see the cloth as it came into being, choosing colors and patterns before the weaving was done. Stone carvers, woodworkers, toolmakers all found places to work within the heart of the growing settlement, their tools becoming as common a sound in the air as the footsteps of traders and the splash of water from jars being filled. But growth brings more than trade. The channels that had once served a single village now had to feed many mouths. New ones were dug, wider and deeper, reaching farther into the spreading city. Grain stores grew taller and thicker walled, their cool interiors holding the harvest of many fields. The open spaces where the community gathered for announcements, and ceremonies became larger, sometimes shaded by great mats hung high between poles, sometimes ringed with low walls to keep the crowds contained. The sound of building became constant, the slap of wet clay, the scrape of reeds being split, the rhythmic pounding of earth into floors. From the temple's steps, one could see the change in the land, where once there had been open stretches. Between homes, there were now walls upon walls, roofs upon roofs, paths threading like veins through the mass of buildings. Smoke from 100 cooking fires drifted upward in pale columns, blending into a haze that caught the sun and made the air glow. The riverbank was lined with boats, some small and narrow for fishing, others broader for carrying heavy loads, of grain or goods upriver and down. The docks, once a simple slope of earth, now had places reinforced with stone and wood, where boats could be tied and goods unloaded without sinking into the mud. The river itself seemed to accept the change. It carried away jars of oil, baskets of dried fish, bundles of cloth. It brought back reeds, clay, and goods from far-off villages. Traders came more frequently now, some staying for days, sleeping. In the city, their boats moored close enough that they could hear the heartbeat of the market. The river's voice mixed with the city's, the two inseparable. At night, the city became something wholly different from the villages that had come before it. Fires burned in courtyards and along the market lanes, their light painting the walls with a soft, golden shimmer. The smells of cooking filled the lentil stew rich with herbs, bread browning on flat stones, fish roasting slowly over coals. Laughter and song moved from house to house, carrying the warmth of human connection. Through the narrow streets, somewhere a drum might beat softly, marking the rhythm of a dance or the telling of a story. And yet, even in this growing complexity, the heart of the city still beat in the temple. Its walls caught the first light of dawn and the last glow of sunset, its open spaces filled with voices in prayer or celebration. From here, decisions still rippled outward: when to plant, when to store, when to prepare for the next flood. The temple's shadow touched every part of the city, not with command, but with presence. Belonging began to mean something different. People were no longer only of a family or of a riverbank, they were of the city. Its name carried weight when spoken to strangers. Its reputation for craft, for abundance, for fairness in trade, became part of each person's own story. Pride took root in the streets, in the stalls, in the walls of the houses, growing stronger with each passing season. If you close your eyes and walk through it now, you can feel it, the firmness of packed earth beneath your feet, the rough weave of a red mat under your hand, the press of bodies moving through the market, the warmth of a jar of grain just lifted from the sun. You can hear the blend of voices and footsteps, the call of the river, the murmur of the temple, and you know you are no longer in a village. You are in something larger, something alive, a place that does not just shelter people, but shapes them, a place whose name will endure long after the hands that built it have turned to dust. This is the first city, and it breathes around you like a living thing. Block 10, between cities once there had been only the rivers and the small villages scattered along their banks, each tending its fields, each guiding its own channels, each marking the seasons by the same floods and the same stars. Then the villages had grown around the temples, the markets had expanded, the houses had pressed closer together until the streets themselves seemed to pulse with life. And now, along the wide curves of the Tigris and Euphrates, there were many such cities, a cluster of walls, roofs, and voices. each casting its own reflection into the water, each a living world unto itself. At first, the relationship between these cities was as gentle as the meeting of two currents. Traders moved between them as they always had, now carrying goods not only from the river's edge, but from the workshops and markets at the city's heart. A jar of oil from one place might sit beside a woven mat from another, a length of dyed cloth from a third. Boats tied at the docks carried names known to many, their captains greeted like family after long journeys. News travelled with them of harvests, of festivals, of new walls being raised or new temples being dedicated. The rivers served as the great threads binding the cities together. Downstream, the journey was swift, the current carrying boats with barely a need for paddling, the wind filling small reed sails and pushing them toward their destinations. Upstream was slower, the poles biting into the riverbed, the ropes pulled by strong hands along the shore, but even here there was no sense of separation. The water linked them all, carrying not only goods and people, but the shared rhythm of life between the rivers. And yet, as the cities grew stronger, so too did the desire to guard what was theirs. A stretch of fertile land just beyond the city's fields might be claimed by another settlement. A cluster of fishing weirs downstream might be dismantled by hands that were not their own. Channels dug to guide the river's water to one city's fields might lower the level for another. At first, such matters were settled with words sent by boat, meetings held at neutral gathering places, gifts exchanged to smooth the path toward agreement. But sometimes the river carried back other kinds of news. A group of men seen guarding the fields with spears, a watchtower raised on the edge of disputed land, a boat turned away from a dock. Still, much more often than conflict, there was cooperation. Cities far apart might agree to send their surpluses to one another in times of need, a shipment of grain in return for a shipment of dried fish, a promise of timber in return for a promise of reeds. Craftsmen traveled between them, bringing new designs for pottery, new methods for building stronger walls, new songs that would be sung in both places. Marriages joined families from different cities, creating bonds that reached beyond the walls. Festivals became occasions not only for the people of one city, but for visitors from others. On such days, the market swelled with goods from many places. Jars carved with patterns not seen before, spices with unfamiliar scents, fabrics and colors that seemed to hold the depth of distant skies. The streets filled with voices speaking, in accents slightly different from one's own, laughter ringing across the crowd as friends reunited after seasons apart. In the temple, offerings from many cities were laid on the altar, the prayers spoken in many voices but rising as one. And yet, beneath the slow flow of cooperation, there was always the undercurrent of rivalry. Which city built the tallest temple? Which market was most abundant? Which fields yielded the richest harvest? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they lived in the minds of leaders and traders alike, shaping choices in ways that were as subtle as they were enduring. The river itself carried these rivalries, just as it carried everything else. A traveler moving downstream might be warned by one city about the high prices in the next, or about a leader who drove hard bargains. Upstream, the talk might turn to which city had sent the most goods that season, or whose walls were growing higher. And in times when the floods came low, or the rains failed, the tension between cities could grow as quickly as the water receded, each looking to protect its own stores before thinking of others. Still, the life between the cities was defined more by connection than by conflict. On quiet days, a boat leaving one city could pass others along the way, their docks busy with traders, their roofs catching the sun, their markets visible from the water as flashes of color and movement. At night, the lights of a city ahead could be seen from far downriver, a shimmer in the darkness, drawing the traveler onward. Each city was a star along the river's course, and the rivers themselves, the long winding threads that bound them all into the same tapestry. If you close your eyes now, you might imagine yourself on one of those boats. The water gliding past beneath you, the air warm with the scent of the river and the goods you carry. You can hear the quiet murmur of the oars, the creak of the ropes, the distant call of a market already waking in the city you approach, and you would know, as the people of Mesopotamia once knew, that between these cities lay not empty space, but the living flow of trade, of stories, of friendships and rivalries, all moving together in the long, slow current of the rivers. Block 11. Alliances and tensions. There had always been a rhythm to life along the rivers, a pattern of exchange and cooperation that seemed as natural as the turning of the seasons. The cities shared the same waters, the same floods, the same sky heavy with the scent of rain before the storms. They were tied together by boats and trade, by marriages between families, by songs and stories that traveled from one market to the next. But beneath that surface harmony, the slow pull of rivalry had always been there, like a second current beneath the river's calm face, moving quietly, almost invisibly, yet shaping the course of everything it touched. In times of plenty, these undercurrents went unnoticed. The markets overflowed, the storerooms stayed full, and the festivals drew crowds so large that the streets seemed to pulse with joy. On such days, visitors from other cities were greeted as honored guests. Alliances were spoken of not in formal terms, but in the warmth of shared meals and the laughter of trading partners. A shipment of barley sent in a good year might be repaid. In fish or timber seasons later, the balance kept in memory and trust. Leaders met during festivals to exchange gifts, carved vessels, rare stones, fine cloth, and to speak quietly of their shared interests. But when the floods came late, or the rains failed, or the river ran lower than expected, the undercurrents rose closer to the surface. Questions sharpened. Why should we send grain to a neighbor when our own stores are light? Why should their boats fill with fish while ours return nearly empty? Disputes over fishing waters, over the course of irrigation channels, over the right to harvest from certain groves began to grow more heated. At first, they were settled by words, in gatherings, held at neutral sites, or in the shadow of a temple. But sometimes words bent under the weight of need, and what began as argument ended with hands gripping spears. It was in these moments that alliances began to take formal shape. Cities that had always been friendly grew closer still, agreeing to protect each other's fields, to share the cost of digging new channels, to send help if the walls of one were threatened. These agreements were marked not only with words, but with axe marriages arranged between influential families, large feasts where the leaders ate together in full view of the people, the exchange of sacred objects kept as symbols of trust. The river became the lifeline of these alliances. Boats traveled with greater purpose, carrying not just goods, but messages, soldiers, and supplies. Docks were reinforced to handle more traffic, and watchtowers were raised to guard the approaches, from water and land alike. The cities closest in alliance began to time their festivals together, so that their people might travel and celebrate as one. Songs were written in which both cities were named, their fortunes tied in verse as they were in pact. But the same river that bound allies also carried the seeds of conflict. When disputes grew too sharp, when one city accused another of diverting water or raiding a storehouse, the boats that arrived at the docks carried not gifts, but armed men. Spears and shields appeared in the market squares, and the streets emptied as people waited to see whether the tension would break. In some cases, the threat alone was enough to bring both sides back to the table. In others, the first clash might come quickly, a fight between traders, a skirmish on disputed land spreading into something larger before either side could turn it aside. And yet, even in war, the rivers remained. The same boats that carried warriors would one day carry goods again. The same waters that had reflected the fires of burning storehouses would, in time, carry the reflections of festival lanterns once more. The people understood that life between the rivers could not endure without the flow of connection, no matter how fierce the quarrels might become. Wars ended not in the destruction of cities, but in the slow rebuilding of trust, in new agreements, in the return of boats laden with grain or fish instead of weapons. In the quiet after such conflicts, the markets would open again, the streets would fill with the sound of bargaining, the temples would ring with the chants of gratitude for peace restored. Alliances would be renewed, sometimes even stronger than before, shaped by the shared memory of hardship and the desire to avoid its return. And the rivers would flow on, carrying away the silt of old grudges, bringing fresh water to the fields, where new seasons waited to begin. If you close your eyes now, you can see it. Two cities standing apart, yet bound by the same ribbon of water. Their walls rising against the sky, their docks busy with movement. You can hear the creak of ropes as boats are tied, the murmur of voices speaking of both hope and caution, the steady breath of the river moving between them. And you would know, as they knew then, that in this land, survival was never the work of one city alone, but of many, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, always in the shared current that shaped them all. Block 12 voices of power, for as long as anyone could remember, the heart of leadership in the cities had been the temple. Its keepers guided not only the ceremonies, but the rhythms of planting and harvest, the settling of disputes, the flow of trade. Decisions were spoken in the open, under the gaze of the people, the river, and the gods. But as the cities grew, as alliances stretched across long distances and disputes reached beyond the borders of a single settlement, another kind of leader began to emerge, one whose strength came not only from wisdom or ritual, but from the will to act swiftly and decisively when the moment demanded it. At first, these figures rose in response to necessity. In times of flood, they organized the building of walls to hold back the waters. In times of drought, they sent workers to dig deeper channels, to fetch supplies from distant allies. When traders were attacked on the roads or the river, they called together men to defend the routes, to stand watch at the docks. They were not yet kings in name, but their voices carried far, and their commands were obeyed even beyond the temple's shadow. Their presence was felt most strongly in the seasons when tensions between cities sharpened. The river carried more. Then grain and goods carried word of disputes, of alliances shifting like sandbars beneath the current, of watchtowers raised in places that had once been open ground. In these times, the people looked to someone who could speak for the city as a whole, who could meet with the leaders of other settlements, not only in prayer halls, but in open fields where agreements were sealed with handshakes or with the clash of spears. These leaders were often skilled in more than one art. They knew the weight of a spear in the hand, the steadying feel of a shield at the shoulder. They could walk the length of an irrigation channel and see at a glance where it would fail when the floods came. They could stand in the market and hear not just the chatter of traders, but the deeper currents of worry or hope running beneath it. They were, above all, listeners, listening to the river, to the elders, to the scouts who returned from distant journeys with news of other cities' fortunes. With time, the authority they carried became more formal. In some cities, the temple keepers themselves appointed such figures, calling them protectors or guardians. In others, the people chose them from among those who had shown bravery in defense of the city or skill in keeping its markets open in times of scarcity. And in a few, the leaders took their place by their own strength. Their support built on the loyalty of those they had aided or defended. These men and sometimes women began to see beyond the life of a single city. They understood that the rivers did not recognize the borders drawn by people, that a channel dug upstream could change the fate of a settlement downstream, that a city's wealth could grow or wither depending on the strength of its ties to others. Some sought to bind cities closer together, speaking of shared defenses, shared markets, shared festivals. Others dreamed of uniting the cities, not by agreement, but by the firm hand of command, believing that only under one voice could the land between the rivers know true peace. The first to attempt such unions often began with small steps. A leader might send workers to help repair the walls of a neighboring city after a flood, then leave a garrison of soldiers for protection. Another might invite an ally to join in building a grand temple, its scale greater than any one city could manage alone, its ceremonies binding their peoples together. But as the power of these leaders grew, so too did their ambitions. Patrols along the river became more frequent, not only to guard against raids, but to watch the movements of other cities. Grain collected in times of plenty was stored not only in the city's own granaries, but in depots along the river, ready to supply soldiers or to influence trade. Still, even the most ambitious understood that open war was costly. The rivers fed all, and to poison the flow between cities was to weaken one's own life as much as a rival's, and so much of this early struggle for dominance was conducted in the spaces between through alliances sealed by marriage, through the quiet placement of loyal traders in other markets, through the exchange of gifts whose beauty masked the weight of obligation they carried. In the evenings, the city might still feel unchanged. The markets would hum with the same voices, the temple fires would burn with the same light, the river would flow past with the same low murmur. But in the homes of the leaders, in the quiet chambers behind the market stalls, in the shaded courtyards, where decisions were whispered, the future of the cities was being shaped. If you close your eyes now, you might see such a leader standing at the river's edge at dawn, the water turning to gold in the rising light. You might hear the steady tread of soldiers on the dock, the call of a trader offering goods from another city, the soft murmur of the temple's morning prayers drifting across the square. And you would understand that here, in the space where the sacred meets the practical, where the flow of the river meets the will of a single person, the first true rulers of Mesopotamia were beginning to rise, not yet kings in title, but already shaping the land as kings would, their ambitions stretching as far as the river could carry them. Block 13, the order of the city in the earliest days. The life of a village or city was guided less by rules than by memory, by the patterns handed down from elders, by the agreements made in the open air and remembered by all who heard them. If a man gave grain in one season, he expected fish in another. If a channel was dug with the labor of many, all shared its water in the proper turn. The law was unwritten, living in the minds and hearts of the people, carried forward in the weight of tradition. But as the cities grew, as the walls pressed outward and the markets drew traders from farther and farther away, the threads of memory began to strain. It was no longer possible for every agreement to be witnessed by all, no longer certain that each person knew the old customs, no longer enough for disputes to be settled by the recollection of a single respected elder. And so, under the shadow of the temples and the guidance of the rising leaders, the first structures of written order began to take form. At first, they were no more than records' clay tablets, marked with the shapes that stood for jars of grain, for bundles of reeds, for skins of oil. These marks preserved the memory of trade, ensuring that what was promised would be delivered. But soon the marks began to carry other meanings, the terms of an agreement, the boundaries of a field, the schedule for the opening of an irrigation gate. What had once been only the record of the market began to grow into the record of the city itself. Scribes emerged as a new kind of craftsman. Their tools were reeds cut to a fine point, their clay carefully smoothed before the marks were pressed. Into it, they worked in the cool shade of the temple courtyards, or in rooms set aside in the homes of leaders. Their hands steady, their eyes trained to see the smallest detail, they became the keepers of the city's memory, their work as necessary to its life as the farmer's plough or the potter's wheel. With written records came the possibility of written rules. Disputes could now be judged not only by recollection, but by reference, by looking to the tablets where agreements were recorded, by consulting the marks that set out the rights and duties of each. The elders and the new rulers began to set down the customs that had guided them for generations: how to divide water in times of drought, how to settle the price of grain, how to resolve a quarrel over land. In doing so, they took what had been fluid and made it fixed, what had been living in memory and made it endure in clay. These early laws were as much about harmony as about control. They spoke of fairness in trade, of the proper measure of goods, of the times when work should be done for the good of the city as a whole. They sought to keep the peace between neighbors, to protect the weak from being overpowered by the strong, to ensure that the blessings of the river and the land were shared in the way the gods intended. And because they were written, they could be remembered exactly, not only by those present when they were made, but by those who would come generations later. In the heart of the city, the administration began to take shape. Messengers carried orders and news from one quarter to another. Overseers walked the irrigation channels to ensure the water flowed as it should. Storehouses were counted and guarded, their contents recorded on tablets kept in the temple. The city's life was now a web of connections, each strand watched and maintained by hands trained for the task. The people felt the change most in the small details of their days. A trader from another city could now trust that his goods would be weighed with the same measures as at home. A farmer could know that the water he needed would reach his fields when it was his turn. A dispute over land could be settled by showing the tablet that marked its boundary, rather than by the uncertain recollection of an old witness. Life became not only more organized, but more predictable, a quality as valuable as any crop. And yet, for all its formality, the order of the city still flowed from the same source as the river's life: the need to keep balance. The tablets, the laws, the scribes, the overseers were tools to ensure that no one voice, no one hand, no one will could hold too much power without the consent of the whole. It was still understood that the city's strength lay in its unity, and that the laws existed not to bind the people to the rulers, but to bind them to one another. At night, in the quiet, after the market had closed and the temple fires burned, lo, the city's records lay stacked in their storerooms. The marks pressed into their clay, as silent and enduring as the stars above. The river whispered beyond the walls, its voice carrying through the darkness. And those who passed near the temple might think of how far they had come from the days when a promise was only a word, to the days when it could be shaped into something that would outlast the voice that spoke it. If you close your eyes now, you can almost feel the cool clay of one of those tablets in your hands, the ridges of the marks beneath your fingertips. You can see the careful work of the scribe, hear the quiet hum of the market outside his shaded room, smell the faint scent of wet earth drifting in from the river. And you would understand that here, in these small but enduring marks, the city had found a way to carry its own memory forward, memory that would survive flood and drought, war and peace, as long as there were hands to shape the clay and eyes to read it. Block 14 words that travel the clay tablets, once used only to mark jars of grain or baskets of fish, now carried the weight of agreements, the boundaries of fields, the rules of trade, and the terms of peace. What began as the careful pressing of marks into damp clay had become something more enduring, a language of memory that could outlive the voice that spoke it and the hands that wrote it. And with that endurance came a new kind of reach. A promise, made in one city, could now be carried to another without the presence of the one who spoke it. A trader could leave his home with a sealed tablet in his satchel, knowing that when he reached a distant market, the words pressed into its surface would be trusted as much as if he had spoken them under the watchful eye of his own temple. An agreement between two cities could be recorded in duplicate, each keeping a copy so that no season, no flood, no shifting of memory could erase its terms. The market stalls began to feel the change first. With written records, traders could agree on the measure of goods without endless discussion. For the tablets kept in the temple defined exactly what a jar contained, what a bundle of cloth should weigh, what a fair price was for a skin of oil in times of plenty and in times of scarcity. Disputes that once might have halted trade for days could now be resolved in moments by consulting the agreed record. And as trust in these records grew, so too did the willingness to send goods farther from home, to cities whose faces were unfamiliar, but whose marks on clay were recognized and respected. The rivers, already the lifeblood of trade, became even more vital. Boats left the docks not only heavy with goods, but with messages tablets, sealed with impressions unique to the sender. Their clay hardened by the sun or fire to endure the journey. A boatman might carry grain from one city to another and return not only with oil or fish, but with a tablet setting the terms for the next season's exchange. The river became not only a road for goods, but a road for agreements, its slow current, carrying the binding words of one city to the doors of another. Diplomacy itself began to change. Where once the leaders of cities had to meet face to face to settle their affairs, now they could send their voices in the form of clay. The words pressed into the tablets were deliberate, considered, free from the heat of a moment's anger or the sway of the crowd. They could be read and reread, weighed as carefully as grain on a scale. In this way, the written word began to temper the sharp edges of rivalry, allowing space for thought, for compromise, for agreements made in the calm of the temple rather than the urgency of the market or the field. Some cities began to keep entire rooms filled with tablets, rows upon rows of flat-baked squares, each one a fragment of the city's history. There were records of trade, lists of debts, inventories of storerooms, agreements with other cities. the terms of peace after a quarrel, the laws that bound the people together. These rooms were cool and quiet, the air smelling faintly of dust and clay, the silence broken only by the soft movement of scribes at work. Here, the city's life was written in a form that would last far longer than the walls that sheltered it. With this permanence came influence. A city known for keeping its agreements, for honoring the words pressed into clay, found its traders welcomed and its alliances sought after. Others might send emissaries, not only to offer goods, but to request copies of certain laws or records, to learn the systems that kept the city strong. In this way, the written word became a tool of power as much as the spear or the wall. The expansion of influence was not always by conquest. Sometimes it was simply by the steady reach of trade, the flow of goods and records along the rivers, the spread of certain ways of measuring, of recording, of resolving disputes. A city whose laws were clear and whose measures were trusted could shape the practices of others, without sending a single soldier beyond its borders. Traders from far-off settlements might return home with more than goods they carried with them, ways of marking agreements, of keeping accounts, of settling quarrels with records rather than with blood. At night, when the markets were empty and the docks silent, the tablets rested in their shelves. The impressions of reeds and styluses, holding fast to the agreements they bore. The flicker of torchlight in the record rooms cast long shadows across the neatly stacked rows, as if the words themselves were sleeping, waiting to be woken by the hands that would read them in seasons yet to come. The river outside murmured in its endless flow, carrying the faint reflection of the moon past the walls of the city, past the docks where tomorrow's goods would be loaded, past the watchtowers where guards stood silent in the warm night air. If you close your eyes now, you can feel the cool clay beneath your fingertips, the delicate ridges of a message sent from one city to another. You can hear the soft scrape of a stylus pressing into wet clay, the measured breathing of the scribe, the distant hum of the market beyond the walls. And you would understand that here, in these small and patient acts, the cities between the rivers were extending themselves far beyond their walls, not through force, but through the quiet authority of words that could travel as far as the rivers themselves could carry them, binding people together in a shared language of trust. Block 15 echoes between the rivers. The story of the land between the rivers is not only the story of the first cities, the first laws, or the first trade. It is the story of how people learned to stay, to build, to remember, and to dream, beyond the reach of their own horizons. From the reed huts by the riverbank to the towering temples at the heart of growing cities. From the quiet exchange of grain for fish to the long agreements pressed into clay and sent downstream, every step was taken in the slow, deliberate rhythm of the water itself. The rivers had always been there, long before the first human foot pressed into their banks. They had carved the land, fed the soil, drawn the paths of countless creatures. But in Mesopotamia, they became something more. They became the living veins of civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates did not simply give water. They gave the possibility of permanence, of roots set deep into the earth. They gave the chance to turn memory into structure, to turn need into cooperation, to turn the passing of seasons into a shared history. Everywhere along their course, the signs of human touch grew, a channel dug by many hands, lined with reeds, to hold its shape. A storehouse with thick walls to guard the harvest. A market square humming with voices in the morning light. A temple whose walls held both the prayers of the people and the records of their agreements. And beyond the walls, the fields wide and gold in the harvest. dark and damp after the floods, green and tender in the first growth of spring. It is easy to imagine a single day in such a city. Dawn breaks over the flat horizon, the light spilling. Across the roofs, the first smoke rising from cooking fires. The streets fill with footsteps, traders opening their stalls, potters carrying new jars to the market, farmers arriving with baskets of grain. At the temple, scribes unroll fresh clay and prepare their styluses, ready to mark the measures and terms that will pass through their hands. Boats glide along the river, their hulls heavy with goods, their sails catching the morning breeze. The sound of hammers, of wheels turning, of animals being led to pasture fills the air. By midday, the city is fully awake. The market is a weave of colors and scent states piled high in baskets, fish shimmering in the sun, bolts of cloth unfurled to show their colors, jars of oil gleaming in the light. Children dart through the lanes, weaving between the legs of shoppers, laughing at the shouts of traders calling them back. The temple's shadow shifts slowly across the square, and in its cool halls agreements are made, disputes settled, blessings given. The river's voice is never far, its steady murmur a reminder that all this life flows because of its constant, patient gift. Evening brings a different rhythm. The market slows, traders counting their earnings, goods packed away for the next day. Fires are lit in the courtyards, the smell of stews and fresh bread drifting through the streets. Families gather, sharing food, stories, and news from the day. Musicians play in the market square, their songs carrying across the rooftops, mingling with the laughter of children and the low murmur of neighbors talking under the first stars. Boats moored at the docks rock gently in the current, their crews resting after the day's journey. And when night settles fully, the city changes again. The streets grow quiet, save for the distant sound of water lapping against the docks, the occasional bark of a dog, the whisper of wind through the reed mats. The temple stands in the moonlight, its walls pale and silent, the marks on its tablets sleeping in the dark. Somewhere the river meets the sea, and somewhere beyond, other waters begin their own journeys. But here, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, life moves in the same slow, steady way it has for generations, measured not in years, but in the turning of seasons, in the rise and fall of floods, in the building of walls and the shaping of clay. And so, the echoes remain echoes of footsteps along the narrow streets, of voices in the market, of songs rising in the temple, of hammers shaping the tools that built the first cities. They are carried on the wind, on the water, on the memory of those who lived and died here. They are the whispers of the rivers themselves, telling the story of the cradle where so much of what we now call civilization first opened its eyes. If you've journeyed with me through these waters and walls, through these markets and temples, through the slow unfolding of life in Mesopotamia, I invite you to linger a little longer. Share your thoughts in the comments so that our conversation can flow like the river between us. Like this video if the story has carried you somewhere quiet and deep. Subscribe so that you can return for the next journey when we will set sail on another current of history. And if you feel the pull of the rivers still in your mind, share this story so that others too can drift into the cradle where it all began and listen to the echoes between the rivers.